Thank you all for coming to our interview presentation. I'm very pleased to introduce our two speakers, both from the local law firm Bernstein and Shur. On my right, Pat Scully. Pat is CEO and chairman of the firm. He was also a 1984 graduate of the law school, so it wasn't too long ago that he was sitting right where you're sitting.
Very long ago.
On my left, Joan Fortin. Joan, unfortunately, had the misfortune of attending another law school. Notwithstanding that, he has managed, despite that slow start, to become a partner of the firm and is also director of the firm's attorney recruiting effort. Without further ado, here to talk about interviewing Pat and Joan.
Hi everybody, thanks for having us and thanks for joining us for your lunchtime. We didn't really talk about how we're starting off. Pat and I have been on the hiring committee at Bernstein Shur together literally for decades, and that was probably another good decade before I got to the firm. And then in the last 10 years, I've been the director of attorney recruiting. So I've overseen the summer programs, so the OCI process of interviewing on law school campuses, as well as what we call lateral recruiting. So when we hire attorneys who are already in practice, I oversee that process as well. And the other thing I do is a ton of courtesy interviews, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But we just have been doing this long enough that there are things that jump out at us as really good things to do or know. And other times we see people interview and think, oh, a little coaching would have helped in advance.
And when Derek sent out to a lot of the law firms an invitation to participate in your mock interview day, we responded and said, well, we can't be there for that, but we have another idea. And the other idea really was to suggest that we do this. Because Joan and I have been doing this for so long that we have seen people who can come in and do a terrific interview, and we've seen really strong students come in and not do very well in the interviewing process. And so we thought it might be helpful to just give you our thoughts about how to do well.
So what we had in mind is Pat and I are both going to talk about different pieces. I'm going to talk about kind of the overall process of interviewing, preparing for interviews, and at least with respect to our firm, how this fits into our hiring scheme, and some broad brush things to think about. And then Pat is going to give you some actual concrete suggestions, do this, don't do that. The key thing for both of us, though, is we really don't want you to be bored to tears sitting there eating your pizza, wondering how much longer we're going to talk. So the point of us being here is a service to you. So we want this to be helpful. So please don't feel like you have to wait until the very end to ask a question. I would be very happy to raise your hand so I can finish my thought. But seriously, let's make this interactive and helpful to you, because our sole purpose of being here is to help you. So if you have questions, let us know. And we'll just kind of get started and share some thoughts with you, and hopefully it'll be a bit of a dialogue. So I'm going to talk about, as I said, kind of the big picture of preparing for your interviews. And really, that starts now. It started last weekend probably. If you did a mock interview, kudos to you for being here. What I think students should do, if you want to get a job while you're in law school and will be interviewing, then you can't do enough to put yourself in a position to be prepared for those interviews. So good for you for being here. The firms will do different things to start introducing you to them, and I honestly don't know what other firms in Portland will do. I know that Bernstein Shur for many, many years has had what we call a 1L reception, and that date just got set. I think it's early April. It's either late March or early April. If you think you want to work in a firm, you should come to that. Not because you necessarily want to work at Bernstein Shur, but it puts you in a position of having to put on a suit or dress up, go to a reception, and interact with real live lawyers in their own home environment. That is good for you. You don't want the first time you walk into a law firm to be your very first interview, if you can help it. So I would say do mock interviews, do things like this. go to firm receptions, if there are other meet and greets, take advantage of the opportunity to talk with lawyers. The other thing that people should consider and don't underestimate the value of is courtesy interviews and networking. You could wait until the actual formal OCI process starts and then do a formal interview with a firm. I would say the vast majority of students do that. But I also see a lot of students who take the initiative early on and do courtesy interviews, or they'll network. They'll use, if you're a Colby Bowdoin Bates grad, I guarantee you there are Colby Bowdoin Bates people at every law firm here. And you don't have to be from one of those schools, but my point is use your networks or cold call. Find some connection if you can. Usually what happens is people ask to meet me for coffee. In my case, I get a lot of those requests, so I always have people come to my office, but I know a lot of my colleagues meet people for coffee all the time. So ask to meet for coffee, or ask if you could just come in and learn a little bit more about the firm. But there's no rule that there's no kind of fair play rule that you have to wait until the OCI process starts to start talking to firms. You don't. And if there's a firm, start doing your research, find out. And let me just say, our orientation is firm because we've been at Bernstein, both of us, for decades. But this advice really applies whether you want a government job or a legal services job. So we'll probably keep saying firm because that's where we come from, but it applies either way. So I encourage you to go ahead and start networking, start doing your research, start thinking about where you might want to interview later, and then find a way to go talk to some of the people that work there. And some people network with me as the head of hiring. That might feel too intimidating or kind of awkward for some people. You don't have to do it with me. Find someone who's a Maine grad, who's a first-year associate, and ask if that person would meet you for coffee. One thing to keep in mind, if you do courtesy interviews, ask the person when you're done if they would let the hiring partner know about those meetings. Lots of my partners tell me, I met so-and-so for coffee, I met so-and-so for lunch, really like the person. It's just a little thing, but if they're favorably impressed and I know it, then when I see your resume, you're gonna get a little extra credit because I know one of my partners is already impressed with you. So if you're gonna do the legwork of courtesy interviewing, a really important piece is make sure to ask the person if they're comfortable doing so to please let the hiring partner know that they've met with you.
Let me just give you a quick example. Several years ago, I got a phone call from a young man who was a student here at this law school. His name is Kevin Decker. And Kevin was a 1L at the time. He reached out to me and said, I know you're an energy lawyer. I'm really interested in energy law. I was wondering if I could buy you a sandwich and we could chat about like how you got into it and what the opportunities are in that field. Now that happens to me probably much more infrequently than it does to Joan. And so I said, sure, I like sandwiches. And so we had lunch in the park. I got to know him a little bit, and then a few months later, his name came through the OCI process, and he's been with us full time now for 2 years, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
He is a fabulous lawyer, but his introduction to us and our introduction to him really started there. And I suspect that if he hadn't done that, given what we know about Kevin, that he would have gotten a job offer anyway if he'd just come through the OCI process. But it had a big impact on me, and it certainly helped him in his efforts.
And one last thought on before we get into the OCI process. So for example, we're going to have a 1L reception. I assume other firms will do something. Follow up. So if you meet someone at that reception, you have a really great conversation, send them a note, send them an email, because those normally will get forwarded to me, and likewise other employers. So if you're interested, let people know. In terms of, I thought it might be helpful for you to hear, at least from our firm's perspective, how on-campus interviewing and law students fits into our overall hiring scheme. We actually do a fair amount of lateral hiring. So we hire, throughout the year, we hire lawyers who have been at other firms. But we have made a firm commitment to ourselves as a firm that we always want to be taking in entry-level lawyers. And so we do our primary hiring of entry level through the OCI process. So for us, that's going to start really soon with that reception. We all take notes about who's there. If you're there and have conversations with people, we're going to have notes from all that. Then we go through the OCI process, and there's screening by resume. So we're going to get a whole big packet of resumes, and 1 or 2 people will come here to interview on campus. And they're going to select up to about 15 people. We can't really interview many more than that in a day. And so we're going to do a whole bunch of on-campus interviews, and then we're going to call back 3 or 4 probably to the firm, and then we're going to have a more lengthy on-campus interview. And then from that, we select our 2L summer class. And from that, our hope is that all of those people will do well over the summer and will stay with us. And come back after graduation after they've taken the bar. So the vast majority of new lawyers we hire are through that process. That's not going to be true for every firm, but I just thought it would be helpful to know how we do it. In terms of what we're looking for, so I want to start moving to the interview, and Pat's going to dive in more detail about the nuts and bolts of how to approach that. But what I want people to know, and what I'm getting at, is the nervousness factor. I can tell almost immediately who's nervous and who's not. And a fair number of people are nervous. And my response to that is this. By the time you get a callback interview at a firm or wherever you're interviewing, you should know that we know you're qualified for the job. There's no legal test. We're not going to be asking you questions about secure transactions or detailed legal questions. We can tell from your GPA, law review, jobs you've had, and that's not to say you have to be on law review, but I'm just saying, by the time we get to an interview, we know you're qualified. So at that point, really what we're looking for is fit. I think any firm you talk to is going to tell you that culture is important to them, and that is certainly true for us. And the way I look at it is we spend a lot of time at work, and a lot of people spend more time at work than at home. And when you put the work week together, and it's really important for us that we hire people who are team players, who are collegial, who are respectful, who don't take themselves too seriously. That's part of the firm personality and the firm culture. We want really super smart, really great lawyers who don't take themselves too seriously. So part of us, what we're looking for is how does that person interact? How comfortable are they in their own skin? How well are they able to hold a conversation? Some of the questions I think of when I'm interviewing someone: would I feel comfortable leaving that person alone in a room with my client, or am I going to be really nervous doing that? So that's what we're looking for. And you know what you need to do to answer those questions? It's really super easy. All you need to do is be yourself. So I think people go into interviews really nervous about how to present themselves and what to say and what not to say and all that. And despite what I'm saying now, Pat is going to cover some of that. But really what we're trying to get a sense of is who is your genuine self, and would you be a good fit for our team? When I talk about fit, then I always want to talk about diversity, and then I always assume people are going, well, how, you're trying to judge if we fit your culture, and then you say you want diversity, and we don't have a lot of diversity, so how do fit and diversity fit in? When we say we want people who fit with our firm, we want people who fit with our values, and some of what I talked about, people who are team players and collaborative and respectful. What I don't want you to hear me saying, because I'm not saying, we do not want cookie cutter lawyers who all look the same. So we really do want a whole wide variety of people. We want diverse lawyers in terms of racial and ethnic diversity and sexual orientation and gender and all that. We want people from different law schools. We want people from different regions of the country. We want people from different age brackets. we really truly believe that the more diversity of thought we have in our lawyer mix, the better client service we're going to offer to our clients. So we want to have a wide variety of people, but the table stakes for us are respect, collegiality, being a team player, showing initiative, those sorts of things. The other thing I'll just mention on for us, and this is going to be different, but the tip I have for you is to find out before you go to a callback interview what the process is. Bernstein Shur is a little bit unique in that we do a group callback for an hour, and so we always try to make sure people know that so they won't be taken off guard. But some firms will do serial short interviews. So you might interview 20, 30 minutes with one person, then you go to the next hall, the next office, next office, next office, next office. We do not do that. We have a group of about 5 people in the room, 4 or 5 people in the room, and we do a group interview. And we think that's really helpful because we see the interaction, we can jump off people's ideas, and we think that's very helpful. But
you don't get asked the same question 6 or 7 times.
Right,
Right. At once.
But you should know, so feel free, when you go through this process, someone is going to call you and invite you for a callback, and it's entirely appropriate for you to say, what is the forum, or what's the format for the callback? Will I be in separate individual interviews, a group interview? So you want to know that. The last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to turn this over to Pat, is we have started changing the types of questions we ask at interviews. And the concept, if you've not heard this yet, that you should Google and learn about, is called behavioral interviewing. Back in the day when I came through the process and when I was on the hiring committee for many years, we had people who asked questions like, what is the most recent book you read? I'm not sure what that tells you about a person, really. So we'd get all sorts of random questions, and we would ask hypotheticals. How do you think you would handle blah blah situation? You know, there's a whole movement in hiring and HR called behavioral interviewing, and really the idea is we don't want to ask hypothetical questions. We want to ask you what you have actually done in certain situations. So it's worth giving some thought to that. So I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head, but I'll tell you what we do. We have a whole bunch of resources on behavioral interviewing, and we have tons of questions broken out by categories. So for example, leadership, and we might have 10 behavioral interview questions under leadership. Initiative, teamwork, you know, just all these different categories with lots of questions. And what we do before callbacks start is, as a hiring committee, we go through and decide which categories we want to focus on that year, and everybody picks a question from that category, and we ask every single callback, we ask those same questions so that we can compare, so that we want to be fair in terms of what we're asking. But that's an opportunity for you to really talk about, and for us to hear how you actually responded, whether it was a difficult situation, how you interacted with other human beings in a work setting. So instead of a hypothetical, it's actual past behavior. The one thing I'll tell you, we don't do this, but you should know, for some organizations that really do behavioral interviewing as it's designed, there's a whole process with scoring, so someone's job is to just listen to the answer and rate the answer. I do know one employer in Maine who does that, one legal employer. That's the only one I'm aware of. But it's worth, as you get ready for interviews, reading up on behavioral interviewing a little bit, just so you won't get caught off guard. Ours, you probably wouldn't know. It feels like our old interviews. We just ask questions and have a discussion. But we know we're asking specific past behavior as opposed to hypothetical future behavior. With that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Pat.
Thanks, Joan. I told Joan on the way in, even though it's 35 years ago, I still get a little kind of tight in my gut when I come into this building. Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about the interview process itself, and I want to start with prior to the interview. And what I really want to encourage you to do is to do some reasonable amount of homework before you go into an interview. And if you're going to interview with multiple firms, try to find out as much as you can about those firms, about what makes them different from one another, about what their areas of practice are, what are they known for, what kind of clients do they represent. To the extent that you can tell from your own research, what's their culture like, have they grown over time? You might even look at important matters or cases that show up that that firm or the lawyers in that firm have been involved with, so that you come in with a better sense as to what that firm is all about. If you haven't done a courtesy interview, but you're coming up for a first or second interview with the firm, and you know someone, maybe someone who was at 3L the year before, has graduated and gone to that firm, call them. Say, hey, I'm going to come for an interview at Bernstein, Shur, Maryland, or Pierce Atwood, or wherever it is that you're going to go at your firm. Can you give me any thoughts about, what the firm is looking for? Ask them about the people who are going to be engaged in the interview, so that you can get a little bit of advance information to help you. Likewise, there may be other people in the community who know about that firm that you can talk to. Professor, if you know a judge. I mean, there's lots of folks out there in the legal community that could give you some background on the firm or firms that you're going to be interviewing with. Also, take a look at the bios of the people that you'll be interviewing with. You should know in advance who's going to be part of the interview. And if you don't know, it's not inappropriate to ask when the person calls to set up your interview to say, hey, who am I going to be meeting with? And if you have that information, then spending a little bit of time with their bios, getting to know them. At the very least, if you can make the connection between the face and the name, it's a really good thing for the interview itself, that you come in knowing, oh, that's Pat Scully or that's Joan Fortin, right? So you can make that connection. Now, I will say there's a fine line here, which is, it's okay to come into the interview and reflect the fact that you know that I was an energy lawyer, or that Joan's done a lot of tip work, or whatever it is that about the individual lawyers. Don't go too far. I mean, I've seen people come into interviews and start quoting things from a law review article that I wrote in 1984. That gets a little weird. Okay? So just kind of try to find that middle ground.
Can I just jump in though? I agree with Pat, you don't want to go too far, but I will tell you, that feels good. When someone just says some little thing that shows that they did their homework and they're paying attention. Because I'll just be brutally honest, there are 9 bazillion candidates out there, and there are a lot of really smart people looking for jobs. So it's like slicing fine hairs, trying to find out of all these really fantastic candidates, which ones are the ones for us. And so when somebody does that little extra and just shows that they really, they've learned about us and they like what they see, or they make some comment about, one of us that shows that they did that, we notice that, and it matters.
On my bio, there's a reference to the fact that one of my hobbies, late in life hobby, is I do musical theater. I've had a number of candidates come in and say, hey, that's really cool, why do you do that, or how did you get into that? That's fine, okay? I mean, that's on the right side of the line, I guess I would say. But you get what I'm trying to get at. Also, as you're preparing for the interview, you should, now that you know something about the employer that you're going to interview with, you should really spend some time thinking about what questions you want to ask that employer. And don't ask everybody you interview with the same questions. Tailor them to the employer and what you know about that firm. And don't ask a question that you should already know the answer to. We will sometimes, when we're interviewing, second round interviews for our summer program, people will come in and ask, do you have a rotation program? Well, that's on our website. So don't ask us a question that you could easily already know the answer to, because it suggests that you're not really doing your homework, or not thinking very hard. I think that really thoughtful questions also demonstrate that you're serious about this, that you're thinking long term, and that you, like us, are trying to determine whether or not this firm or this employer would be a good fit for you. If it's a second interview, I would say don't be afraid to ask questions about things like compensation, wages, benefits, time to partnership, responsibility given to associates, opportunities for advancement. Those kinds of questions rarely get asked in interviews. I'm always surprised, I'll come right to you, I'm always surprised that people in a second interview don't ask those questions. Doesn't it matter to you how much we would pay you?
Well, that they should know.
They should know, with respect to the summer clerkship.
Right.
But having a sense of some of those important, what's your medical plan look like? Or how long would I need to be an associate before you consider me for partnership? Those are questions that I want to know the answer to, so why wouldn't you? So don't hesitate. They're not inappropriate questions at all. Yes, you have.
About, you have that summer program and then you hire on. Of those people that you hire on, what percentage would you say are negotiating their salary at that point?
0.
And do you encourage salary negotiation?
Wow, I feel like you're a plant. I will be talking about the gender wage gap on Thursday.
And maybe you could offer some insight as to how to maybe initiate those conversations.
Yeah, so what we do for both our summer clerkships, that's a set salary, and for our entry-level associates, we as a firm decide each year what our starting entry-level associate salary is going to be. And that generally is a lockstep for the first few years that you're an associate with us. We try very hard not to make significant differentiations in terms of comp for associates in their earlier years. As they get more senior and we've got more evidence of a whole number of factors relating to their performance, we then start to make adjustments in their compensation. And I think as a more senior associate, it's certainly not inappropriate to come to us and ask about what opportunities there might be to get additional raises and to make your case, but certainly not on the front end.
I also want to stay true to our topic, which is interviewing, but I'm happy to chat with you about that later if you would like.
Okay.
To the extent that as you're preparing for the interview, you have a pretty good sense of what makes this particular firm unique or what its culture is or why you think it might be attractive to you, don't hesitate to try to reflect that in the answers that you give and the questions that you ask. In other words, if you know that a firm has a really strong commitment to pro bono, and you do as well, and you think they'd be a good match because of that, bring it up in some fashion in the interview if you're not asked. If you know that the firm likes to give their associates, a lot of responsibility early in their careers, and that's something you'd like, bring it up. In other words, make those connections if they're not already made for you, to make the point that not only do you know something about the firm, but there are things about the firm that are really attractive to you and that fit for you. Also, and when you're preparing your resume, and you may want to think about sometimes tweaking your resume depending on who it is you're going to be interviewing with, but also during the interview, don't hide things from your personal history, and particularly your employment history, that might be of interest to the law firm. In other words, you might have had several jobs sometime in your life, even when you were in high school or college. They weren't legal in nature, and you might think, nobody's going to care about that, so I'm not going to put it on my resume. And it may actually turn out that something you've done in a job, in a volunteer role, really tells us something about you and is of interest to us. And we want to know about that, because that might be one of the things that makes a difference between you and the other 75 people we're interviewing that August, right? So I'll give you a good example of that. When I was a student here and I wrote my resume and I started interviewing for a summer clerkship, one of the things I really struggled with, I had worked for a couple of years between college and law school. One of the jobs that I had, I went out with some friends to Oklahoma and worked as a roughneck on an oil rig. If you don't know what that is, it's a dirty, smelly, grimy job working on an oil rig while it's drilling for oil, right? And I debated with myself whether to put it on the resume or not. And at first I thought, no, that's just going to make me look like something I don't want to be. And I ultimately decided to put it on my resume. When I went to my second round interview at Bernstein, Shur, and I walked into a room where there were, at that time, all of the partners were in the room, so there were like 12 or 14 people in the room. That's all I wanted to talk about. I mean, literally, we talked about that job for a half an hour, and I was wondering, when are we going to get to the kind of legal-related questions? So my point is simply, we want to know about you and interesting things about you and things that you've done and experiences you've had. Don't hide them from us, because they might very well be the things that make the difference, between, that make us really say, that's really cool, that's somebody we're interested in. Before the interview, or as you're getting prepared to come in for the interview, dress like a professional would look. Think about, how would I dress if I were coming into work at this law firm, my first full day at work? Dress like that. You don't need to go way over the top, right? You don't need to go out and buy really expensive clothing. You know, at a law firm, you might want to tailor this somewhat depending on where it is that you're interviewing. So there might be some employers that are a little bit more casual, a little bit more laid back, and would prefer you to be a little bit more dressed in that fashion. And you can always ask the question, right? It's not an inappropriate question. At most law firms, you want to dress, relatively formally in business dress clothes. You know, for a guy, I can do this one easily. It's either a suit or it's a very nice pair of slacks and a sport coat and a tie. Joan may have to help me.
Don't even try.
Don't even try? Okay. This is one of those places where I get into trouble.
Move on.
You know, once you've got the job, you can adjust your style of dress to kind of fit with whatever the expectations are of the place. I think my wife always tells me this, if it's a close call, a little bit better to be a little too overdressed than a little too underdressed, right? But also, as you're getting ready to come to the interview, check your clothing. Check yourself out in a mirror. If you're wearing a tie, is the tie straight? Have you combed your hair? Is everything in place? Just little things. Is your clothing pressed and neat? Are you buttoned up? You know, like a professional would look. And I would say in general, avoid a lot of, if you're somebody who likes a lot of big jewelry or heavy stuff, avoid it, not because there's anything wrong with it, just it can be distracting in the interview process, right? And before you walk through the door, make sure you've turned off your cell phone. It is really embarrassing for you, not so much for us, but for you if it goes off in the middle of an interview. When you walk into the room, first impressions are really critical. And we've done this so often that, I can usually tell in the first 2 or 3 minutes whether I am interested in a candidate.
I would say seconds. Not kidding. I'm not kidding. Dead serious.
So come in prepared. Start with a smile, first of all, and a firm handshake. If you're somebody who's got sweaty palms, bring some paper towels and dry them off or whatever so that you can try to avoid it to the extent that you can. But I'll tell you, I don't know if you've ever experienced somebody with a really weak handshake. It can be off-putting from the beginning. It sounds like a small, kind of silly thing, but it kind of sets the tone in a strange way. Look us straight in the eye when you say hello, when you first have that interaction. And if you know who, as I mentioned earlier about knowing who it is you're going to talk to, if you know their name, say their name. Hi Pat, hi Joan, I'm Mary. It's really nice to meet you. So start out with that kind of impression. It makes all the difference in the world.
I just want to comment on the handshake. I personally have such a negative visceral reaction when I get the little wimpy hair shake. It's really, I have to consciously try to overcome it. That might sound silly. If you don't think you have a firm handshake, I'm dead serious. You need to practice. And practice with your friends or whatever. But because if you haven't read Malcolm Gladwell's work, you should. But people form opinions instantly. And even, for someone like me, I try to override. But I am overriding a negative impression the second I touch your hand and it's wimpy. So, and I'm not alone, I've heard lots of other people say the same thing. So, shake hands with each other, and if you get any feedback that you don't have a good firm handshake, then you've got to work on that before interviews. I know that sounds silly, but I'm dead serious.
Now, you're not trying to crush fingers, okay? So, it's just really a good, solid, firm handshake. When you come in and you sit down for the interview, sit upright. okay, don't do this. I mean, really, some people do this, you know, or they get way back, like, you know, it's like, yeah, whatever. I bet these things all send a message. Your body posture sends a message. If you're upright, okay, if you're maybe a little forward or a little bit forward in your chair, it sends a message that you're engaged, that you want to be there, that you're a part of the process. Don't cross your arms and don't like put your body into a position that looks like you're kind of closed off from the people that are interviewing with you. There are lots of resources out there by people who know much more about this than I do, about body posture and what signals it sends. But believe me, we see people who send those kinds of signals, and again, it's very off-putting from the beginning.
And I think it's nervousness, I will say. I don't think people don't care. I think they're just trying so hard to be relaxed that they look too relaxed, you know, so.
You want to get the jumper cables out. During the interview, and I guess this would be my number one point, I think Joan made this at the outset, and I shouldn't use this expression, but I sometimes have what I call a potted plant interview, okay? That is where the person sits there, waits for a question, answers it, and then waits for the next question and answers it, and then waits for the next question and answers it. I will tell you, as an interviewer, I want to shoot myself about 5 minutes into that interview, okay? This needs to be a conversation. We want to learn about you, you want to learn about us. It's not an interrogation. Treat it as a conversation. And that, if you look at it that way, that should also help you get over your nerves a little bit. Engage with the interviewers. Come with things that you want to say. Come with questions that you want to ask. You don't want to dominate the interview, because I've seen that happen as well. But you want to be an active participant in the interview.
So keep in mind what I talked about before. When I talked about fit, we spend a lot of time together. So when we're interviewing, we want to find out who's it going to be fun to work with. I mean, again, intellectually, you've already passed our test. So we're trying to figure out who am I going to enjoy being on a case with? Or if I'm closing a deal at 3 in the morning, is it going to be okay to have this person in the room? Or if I've got my favorite client who I really, really have this great relationship with, am I going to want Eric? And so we just want to have a conversation and get to know you as a human being. And what I always tell candidates is, remember, this goes 2 ways. You do not want a job where you have to go to work every day and put on your work face. And I know people have had those jobs, and you probably do too, right? You want to have a job, I would think, where you can go to work and be yourself, and be your best self, and do your best work, and know that you're valued for who you are and what you have to contribute. So bring that person to the interview. And guess what? If it's not a good fit, it's better you know that early on, because you want a place where you feel comfortable too. So it goes both ways. I do want to give a concrete example about the interviewee who doesn't engage. I had an interview a number of years ago, and I interviewed a woman who was #1 in her class. Fantastic on paper, and I went into the interview assuming this is someone we might want in our summer program. And afterwards, I didn't give her a call back. And it was a little bit of time went by, and she reached out to me and asked if I would give her feedback. And she said, I'm not getting any callbacks, and I don't understand why. Would you be willing to give me feedback? And then we had a very candid conversation. I gave her specific examples from our interview. And you probably haven't read my bio, but I practiced in Alaska for a little while. I'm admitted in Alaska. I own property in Alaska. Alaska is all through my bio if you're looking carefully. She had just come back from a vacation in Alaska. And again, I was just trying to get to know her a little bit. That's a super easy topic for me to talk about. I tried to talk about Alaska. She would not engage at all. And I was just trying to make conversation, and I got wooden face and one-word answers and just didn't engage. And so I thought, wow, that's odd. And so throughout the interview, I kept trying to engage, and nothing. I got nothing back. So I told her, I said, I thought you weren't interested. You didn't show any interest in me personally. You didn't show any interest in my firm. I got no sense you even wanted a job at my firm. And her answer was, I was trying to evaluate the firm. I was trying to evaluate whether you were someplace I wanted to work. And I said, well, you do need to do that, right? You do need to evaluate which employers you actually want to go work with. But at the same time, it's a two-way street. I'm trying to evaluate you, you're trying to evaluate me. We have to start forming a relationship in order to determine whether there's something there. So if you're at the top of your class and you know you're likely to get a whole bunch of callbacks, you cannot go to the first round interviews and kind of be like, do I want to work at that firm or do I want to work at that firm? Because nobody's going to want to work with you, right? So engage with the employer and the interviewer.
And you know, nerves are okay, we all have them, but you're really going to have to try to get control of them, and people use different ways of doing it. But keep in mind, again, as Joan said earlier, this is not an interrogation. We don't want you to fail. We want you to succeed. The person doing the interview wants to see the best you. They want to see you be yourself and be awesome in the interview. They're on your side, right? They just want to get that from you. And maybe one way to think about it is for you to kind of sympathize with the interviewer. I mean, if you can just imagine in your own head what it's like to look at hundreds of resumes and interview tens or dozens or multiple dozens of people, it's hard to do. And it's hard, and it's, you know, we're looking for those extra little things, these subjective things in addition to the objective stuff that's on your resume. And if you can think about how can I make this experience more pleasant for that person instead of worrying about how I feel internally, you can turn it externally. I think it'll help you maybe get beyond kind of your own fear or your own nerves and really engage more fully. And again, I think, you know, keep in mind what the interview really wants. They don't really want to focus on, or at least we don't want to focus what's on the resume, other than as a starting off point for conversation. We want to know about you. Who are you? What's unique about you? What interesting things have you done? What are you passionate about? What vision do you have for your own future? What sets you apart? Why should we want to have you as a part of our team, as opposed to all the other good candidates that we get to see? And that really means wanting to kind of get an inside glimpse on you. I would also say be interested in the person who's interviewing you, but genuinely listen to them. I sometimes see people in interviews and as the interviewer, you're asking them questions or you're talking to them and you can tell that they're like thinking about what's the next thing that's coming after this or what's the next question I'm going to ask. Be in the moment with the interviewer. Listen carefully. And react genuinely to what they're saying. If they ask a question or if they make a statement about the firm that rings to you, then you can jump in and follow on with that and add your own perspective to it. But you can only do that if you're really in the moment with them, right? And allow the conversation to go where it's going to go. You know, sometimes I've been in law court arguments where I was too worried about getting the points that I had down on paper out and not worried enough about answering the questions that the judges had for me. And you know, one of the things I've learned is their questions are more important than what I have written down on my piece of paper. The same thing is true here, right? Don't let your stuff get in the way of letting this conversation go where it's going to go, because if it goes freely, that's probably a good thing, a sign of a good thing. Listen really carefully to the questions that are asked of you. If it's a difficult question or a question you need to think about, it's totally okay to take a time out, to take a little break, catch your breath, and formulate the answer in your head. You know, and if the question is truly one to which you don't have an answer, you know, like we tell people when they're preparing for a deposition, I don't know is an acceptable answer, right? Don't be afraid if it's a question you really don't have an answer to.
That's particularly, well, I shouldn't say particularly true, it's true, period, but in behavioral interviewing, sometimes we'll say, tell me about a time when you had a really difficult situation with another person at work, and how did you handle that? Well, maybe you haven't had a lot of other jobs and you've never had that happen. It's better that you're honest than that you try to make something up or try to put together something that doesn't really fit. And you can say, well, I haven't really had that situation at work. I can tell you about a situation I had on my basketball team, if you'd like to hear about that, and we're likely to say, yeah, sure, that's fine, tell us about that one. So just, it's okay if you don't have a specific answer. Can I go back to the resume thing? I just want to say, we're oriented to doing decades of interviewing at Bernstein, Shur. Other interviewers might be very focused on your resume in a way that we're not. You should know your resume cold. If you interview with us, we're probably not going to spend a ton of time on your resume, but another employer might. So there should not be anything on your resume that you are not completely comfortable talking about at a moment's notice.
My first interview in this building with Bernstein Shur was with Barney Shur, who was one of the founders of our firm. He was 70-something when I interviewed with him. And the first thing he said is, you misspelled your street name. I was living on Bolton Street, which was not very far from here, and on my resume, I spelled it O-U instead of O, and he picked up on it immediately. Now, I survived that mistake, but it was one I could never make, right? I mean, just simple things like that. When the interview ends, thank the interviewers for their time. Again, throughout the interview, remain friendly and engaged, and at the end, be friendly and engaged, and thank them and use their names if you should have them down at that point, right? If you can't memorize them as you're sitting there, write their names down on a pad of paper, but use their name. Thank you, Joan, I really appreciated your time. And if it hasn't already come up, offer to give them a writing sample. We oftentimes will say, we'll follow up with you if we want one, but it's totally appropriate to say, would you like a writing sample? And I've got one here with me. I would also suggest that after the interview is over, promptly sit down somewhere and take notes on what just happened and who said what and who asked you what, to the extent that you can recall it. Because I think what you want to do after the interview is to follow up with a note to each of the people that you interviewed with. And if you've got contemporaneous notes on what happened, then when you sit down to actually write a note or write an email, then you'll have a better recall as to what happened. Personally, I recommend a handwritten note. I think it's more personal. It doesn't work for everybody, and it's not the end of the world if it's an email. But I do think it should be personalized. In other words, if Joan asked you a question about something, you had an exchange with her about something, then in your note to her, reference that. And in your note to me, reference something else. And so those kinds of things just demonstrate that you were paying attention, that you're very interested, and in the note you can restate your interest. There's nothing wrong with saying, I'd really like a job.
I'm noticing the time.
Yeah.
We should get to questions. I want to say in the notes, I recommend handwriting too. Most thank you notes I get are email now, and as the head of hiring, I get them all, and I'll tell you, it feels like an obligation because it feels rude of me not to then respond to your thank you note, which kind of defeats the purpose. So a handwritten thank you note feels great. An email thank you note is better than no thank you note, but I often then feel guilty if I don't respond to it, and I'm too busy to respond to most of them, so it's whichever. It's fine, but do a note. Sorry, we talked a little longer than we actually planned on, and we don't have a ton of questions. I know you have a
I was
question
just
here.
going to ask the handwritten note for Stephen.
Yeah.
Yeah. What other questions do you have? We're trying to do a data dump of.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you guys for coming in.
Sure.
And if you would be willing, it'd be great if you could share your notes with us, if you'd be willing to share. I guess,
Pat can because he
Yeah.
typed his out. Mine are handwritten scratches.
I'm curious in terms of the fit part of it. I think with certain firms, it's easier to figure out their fit. Beforehand, there's plenty of people to reach out to. There's plenty of resources to get that information, but specifically, I'm a student that's not from Maine. Obviously, there's resources here at the school, but in terms of finding out the fit when all you have is just, the information on a website and the information in their, 3-paragraph long job posting, what strategies would you give in terms of digging deeper, but especially when those resources maybe aren't as obvious?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we do the group interview for the second interview is in part to get at that, because we think that if there's 4 or 5 of us in a room with you, that there's a better opportunity for you to get a sense of what the culture of the organization is, because you're seeing us all kind of interacting with one another. So that's one way to do it. I don't know that there's any magic answers to this other than just, pursuing anybody who's clerked there before. I think following your own network of people to try to find out what you can find out about people's experiences there. If there are students here that clerked there the prior summer, or graduates who've now gone on and worked at those firms, there's certainly no downside to calling up somebody, even if you don't know them, who's a recent Maine Law grad and is now at that firm, and say, hey, I'm preparing for OCI, and I'd love to get your feedback on what's special, what's unique, what the culture is like at your firm.
The other thing is, I would suggest when you go to an interview, one question that you could all ask is, could you describe the type of new associate who is successful at this firm? Because I could answer that right off the top of my head, and I bet you get a very different answer, at firms all over the place, or employers. So I think that's just one piece of your investigation in terms of fit and culture.
A lot of people ask the question, there are a lot of good firms in Portland, culture is important to me, what makes your culture different than the other firms? It's not a bad question, but sometimes you may find that you're getting something very similar in people's answers, because we all think we've got a great culture at our firms, right? So that, again, it's worth asking, but I wouldn't necessarily bank on it.
And we try really hard not to comment on the culture of other firms. I really do not want our people commenting, trying to say, well, we're better than that firm. So do your own homework on that. What questions do you have? I want to try to get to more of what you want to know.
You guys mentioned a couple times about, top of your class, law review, stuff like that. What kind of advice would you give, not for someone who's dead last in the class, but where do you, from your firm perspective, how do you view, is there a requirement that you're top of your class, or how do you factor in that sort of situation?
For Bernstein, Shur?
Yeah, and maybe just generally what you've seen.
Well, at least with respect to our firm, and actually that brings up a point I was going to make earlier, so I'm going to start with this point. Go through whatever your process, OCI, however you're getting your first job. But I would say set your professional goals and don't let go of them, and don't get deterred. I can name off the top of my head, I'm not going to name them, I can think of 3 leaders at Bernstein Shur who went to Maine Law, who did not get a job through OCI, they did not come through our summer program, and they did not start their career at Bernstein Shur. They later came to us as a lateral hire, and they are significant leaders in the firm. So by virtue of the fact that even though, obviously not all firms in Maine do OCI or have a summer program or hire that way. And those of us who do, I mentioned, we try to hire from different schools, so we don't hire that many anyway. We're not going to hire only from Maine. So I'm sure there are really fantastic people in this room who would be great, who won't necessarily get a job. And I'm just using our firm as an example. This goes for any job you want. You might not get it the first time, but don't be deterred. Keep going, do your thing, get your skill, improve your skills, and then come back at it another time, I would say. In terms of when we come on campus, we generally try to hire out of the top 10. I'm just being, direct and honest about what we're looking for. When we come here, we generally look for the top 10 and law review. But I can, again, name people in my firm who did come through OCI who didn't have either of those things. So, there's no hard and fast rules. We really do look for the actual human connection and potential, and sometimes we see it in people who, didn't have the most stellar grades in law school, but we see other things in their resume and in their interactions that let us know that they would be a good fit, and those people are really good lawyers.
I think in general, obviously different employers and different kinds of legal employers care more or less about GPA. And you will learn that as you start to go through the process about how important that is to different employers in the interviewing process. But in general terms, to the extent that your GPA is not as high as you'd like it to be, I think it becomes that much more important to emphasize in your resume and in your interviews the other things that you've done in your life that make you a really interesting, promising candidate, right?
And in your cover letter.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you again for coming right before the interview first. My question has to do actually with what can a new graduate potentially offer? When you're thinking about what seasoned associate might also be confusing in terms of what they could be providing for your firm. I know that the OCI process seems like it's trying to streamline it a bit, but what can a Maine Law graduate, a recent graduate, bring in terms of their experience, their practical legal experience to a firm? How do you try to tailor it in that respect?
My response to that is it's not your practical legal experience that we're looking for. Generational depth is extremely important to us. We try to make sure that we have really good, solid lawyers at every step along the way. And you're not competing for a job with a really talented lawyer who's got 3 years at Sidley Austin. You're just not. So what we're looking for are, again, all those fit things I talked about, people who have demonstrated academic success, so we know you're smart, we know you're a hard worker. I personally look for drive and initiative because we want people who are eventually going to be able to build a book of business, they're going to be able to attract clients, they're going to maybe develop a whole new area of the law that our firm isn't practicing in right now. So I'm looking for all those qualities, and I can see those qualities in a brand new lawyer. I'm not looking for your legal expertise because you don't have it yet. And so we're looking for something different when we interview new students.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up, but I want to say thank you very much for attending.